Really excited to be here this afternoon. I've got a fantastic panel to look at the issue of foreign terrorist fighters and returning and relocating in particular. So I'm joined by Dr. Eli Carman, a senior research scholar at ICT, IDC, Herzliya, but obviously known to a lot of you, I'm sure, as a scholar with a wealth of experience in CT. We've got Dr. Magnus Ranstorp, the research director at the Centre for Asymmetric Threat Studies at the National Defence College in Sweden. We've got Miss Lydia Khalil, a research fellow in the West Asia programme at the Lowy Institute in Sydney. We've got Miss Meredith Stricker, the executive director of the Soufan Centre. And last but not least, we've got Dr. Zelin, the Richard Borow fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. So I'm David Wells. I'm a political affairs officer at the CTED, the UN's Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate. I head up our political analysis and research unit, so that's focuses really on CTED's work on trends, analysis, and engagement with the research community, of which this is going to be a significant part. Before we start, I'd just like to give a really brief overview of the UN's work on foreign terrorist fighters, the nature of our interest, how we got to where we are in 2018, before kicking off with introductory statements from the panel. So it probably makes sense to start in 2014, which, as we all know, is when Abu al-Baghdadi declared ISIL's caliphate, and was probably the point at which the flow of foreign terrorist fighters to Iraq and Syria was at its height. In response, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2178 in September, and that was really focusing on taking measures to stem that flow of foreign terrorist fighters to the conflict zones. So it included lots of key measures, but notably around the criminalisation of foreign terrorist fighter offences, improved border security measures, and a lot more focus on information and intelligence sharing at a local, national, regional, and international level. Those measures were introduced in September 2014. By December 2015, the Security Council followed this up with a special meeting in Madrid, where it adopted the Madrid Guiding Principles. The basic aim of this was to try and provide some practical guidance, taking it away from the resolution to some more specific recommendations. So fast forward to 2017, it was clear that alongside the military progress made in Iraq and Syria to reclaim that territory that ISIL had conquered, that these measures introduced by member states have made a significant impact on the ability of foreign terrorist fighters to travel to the conflict zones. But alongside that process, which obviously damaged the ISIL brand and really shifted the narrative to focusing on remaining where you were and carrying out attacks in your own territory. But as a result of that shift, in December 2017, the Security Council adopted Resolution 2396. This focused on the issue of returning and relocating foreign terrorist fighters, which is what we're here to discuss today. Lots more key measures in that resolution, including more on travel and border security, and really focusing on trying to detect that flow out from the conflict zones. This includes requirements for member states to introduce advanced passenger information systems, passenger name records, terrorist watch lists, and biometrics. So a significant focus on identifying those foreign terrorist fighters trying to leave the conflict zones and wherever possible detaining them. But because of the transnational nature of this problem, it also looked at improved international cooperation. So significant focus on criminal justice issues, mutual legal assistance, and the ability to move those detained foreign terrorist fighters back to their country of origin. But there's a number of other issues that addressed that perhaps the original resolution hadn't addressed, and it really focused in quite some depth at the issue of families, of returning and relocating foreign terrorist fighters, but also the longer-term issue of radicalisation to violence in prisons, and how member states could deal with those foreign terrorist fighters who'd returned. So that's broadly where we got to by the end of last year. So, as I'm sure you can imagine, foreign terrorist fighters is a massive priority for CTED. We're the UN Security Council's CT body, and foreign terrorist fighters as an issue encompasses a wide range of counter-terrorism challenges, as I'm sure you're all aware. Huge priority for CTED. For those of you not familiar, CTED was created as an assessment body, so its initial role was focusing on how are member states implementing Security Council resolutions. But what's changed in our latest mandate at the end of 2017 was a much greater focus on identifying trends, looking forward to what the future problems might be and analysis. As you can imagine, though, in our assessment process, we engage with all member states. Some of the measures in 2396 are fairly well established. Some countries have got biometric systems in place. They use watch lists and have used them for a significant amount of time. Their prison systems perhaps not ideal, but are still able to deal with an influx of violent extremist prisoners. But as I'm sure you can imagine too, there's a lot of member states who are quite a long way away from where they need to be with regard to this resolution. So that's really where this panel comes in, which is to try and look at some of the trends and key challenges, not just relating to Iraq and Syria, but also looking at Libya and North Africa as well, and trying to cover the broad range of challenges and threats that relate to the foreign terrorist fighter returning and relocating issue. So I'm just going to list a few issues that I'd like us to cover, and then I'm going to hand this over to the panel. But just to give them and you a sense of the sorts of issues we'd like to cover, I'd like to look at the scale of the returnee issue so far, the potential threat returning and relocating FTFs have already posed and may pose in future, both as perpetrators, which I think is the issue that a lot of people are focused on rightly, but also looking at the issues of facilitators, recruiters, and radicalizers in future. I'd also like us to touch on the diversity of the foreign terrorist fighter group. There's a lot of young children that travelled with their parents or were born into the conflict zones. We've also seen large numbers of women travelling to the conflict zone for probably the first time. So looking at the additional challenges that this poses. I'd like to look at where next for foreign terrorist fighters if they leave Iraq, Syria, and Libya, and obviously some of them have already done that. So I'm interested to hear where they might have gone. And then more broadly, and most relevantly to CTED's work, understanding how different member states across different parts of the world have approached the returning FTF challenge, and any evidence we've had so far of how effective those responses might be. So in terms of each of the panelists, I'd like them to give me a sort of very general answer to the question of what the most significant current or future challenge relating to returning and relocating FTFs is. I'd like to speak for about 5 minutes. Please be provocative, be concise, and provide us with some thought-provoking comments that we can dig into over the course of the next hour and 20 minutes or so. So I'll hand over to you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I always say to my students that this is the most difficult hour to fight terrorism. After lunch, I hope you will resist and digest what we have to say. But I'll begin with good news, in my opinion, at least. The coalition, the two coalitions, the American, Iraqi, Iranian Shia militias in Iraq, and the Russian, Syrian, and Iranian coalition in Syria have decided in 2015, 2016, that the liberation of the territories under the ISIS control will involve the killing, physical killing of as much terrorists as possible. This was a declared strategy. Even I think General Mattis has said it. The Russian general responsible for the intelligence in Syria has said it. And I have numbers. For instance, the Russians said in 2017, even before the liberation of Raqqa, that they killed 8,000 terrorists. The liberation of Tel Afar in Iraq by the American coalition, 2,400 killed. In Mosul, at least 4,000 killed. And then I don't speak about the wounded and the arrested people, or the prisoners, not arrested, they are prisoners. Suicide bombers. We know that in 2017, ISIS has published the numbers of their suicide bombers, 1,012 only in 2017. This year, at least 700. These are numbers published by ISIS. Most of these suicide bombers are foreign fighters, many of them Europeans, because the Iraqis and the Syrians prefer to continue the fight in their own countries. And these are cannon fodder, if you want. Relocation. We knew from 2016 that there was already a plan to involve the Iraqi fighters in a new clandestine insurgency inside Iraq. I think our colleague Craig he has published an article in 2016, and I have declarations of 6 Iraqi intelligence officers at the same period saying that we know before the liberation of Mosul that there was already a network of clandestine networks of, especially in the desert, but also in the great cities, that were preparing to continue the fight. And we see today, if I have I receive every day practically Daesh daily reports by a small NGO, and you see hundreds of attacks every day, not only in the Sunni territories in Iraq, but also even in Basra or in Baghdad. I think that the same will happen, by the way, in Syria after the liberation or the destruction of the Idlib province, but not only they are the ISIS people, but also the Al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra, or today they call it Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. The relocation has succeeded only partially. According to my observations, at least, the only place where they have been successful is Afghanistan. And this is a very interesting issue because already in 2014-15, they declared Khorasan, which is part of Afghanistan, and Pakistan as a territory, a new wilaya, and they tried to implement themselves there. And for the first 6-8 months, the Taliban killed hundreds, if not thousands, especially Uzbeks, which were members of the former Al-Qaeda associate IMU, and they succeeded in stopping this attempt of relocation. But if we look to the last year, there are a huge number of ISIS new recruits which are staging, I think, awful attacks. I think the most cruel attacks, especially in Kabul and some other cities, I think mainly in the south, 100, 150 people killed in one suicide bombing. In Libya, there is a partial success because in Libya, the Derna city and the Sirte city have been liberated by the pro-Western militias some times ago, a year and a half, but there is a new attempt to conquer these cities, and also Western Libya, close to the Tunisian frontier. And we remind you that in Manchester attack, there were Libyans involved, by the way, probably in contact with some ISIS network in Libya itself. Yemen, they did not succeed to do anything. They are a small group, and there we know that it's Al-Qaeda has a huge presence. Not only it's present in southern and southeastern Yemen, but lately they are in a coalition with the Saudis and the Emirates in order to fight the Houthis more effectively. They are used by the Saudis and the Emirates. And other countries, I think Egypt, there was one of the destinations. They cannot enter really in great numbers in Egypt, and the Egyptian army, together with support, some support, at least intelligence support from Israel, I think, has stopped this wilaya from developing in something more serious. And other places, for instance, Somalia, Somalia and neighboring countries are mainly territories of Al-Shabaab, which is a pro-Qaeda, not ISIS organization. Now, if you look to Europe, and I will try later to speak mainly about Europe, since the attacks in Brussels and Paris in 2015, we didn't see any serious attack which was staged by a network or infrastructure built by ISIS in Syria or Iraq. Because this was the main threat when the liberation of these territories began in Iraq and Syria. In my opinion, it did not materialize until now. We didn't see in the wave of immigration really a kind of big group of people connected between them that had to build this infrastructure. Perhaps we'll see it in 2-3 years. Perhaps they want to be clandestine for some. For the moment, nothing. The only serious attack we saw in Barcelona, but Barcelona is a very specific local attack. And the guy which was responsible for it, the Imam al-Sati, actually was a former Al-Qaeda, not member of Al-Qaeda, but close to many activists of Al-Qaeda in Spain and in Northern Africa, mainly in Morocco. So I don't see Barcelona, perhaps we'll speak again, what is the significance of the Barcelona attack, which is the most important one since Paris and Brussels. So overall, I think that for the moment at least, the situation is relatively optimistic. And I'll speak about the threats and other problems later.
Thank you, Eli. Sorry, Eli. making the same mistake. I don't have such an optimistic perspective, and I'm not going to have it as ambitious or trying to cover the issue of FTFs in Syria or in Iraq. There are enough challenges there. Of course, Europe is dealing with this issue. We've had 5,000 plus FTFs going. They are the country, of course, that had the most is France with around 2,100. Belgium, 600. We had UK 900. Half of them are back. We had the Nordic, well, I think the Netherlands, around 200. Germany, 970, 2,000. We have in the Nordic countries, just in the Nordic countries where I come from, we've had over 500 individuals who have gone. From my own country, Sweden, 300, 150 are back. So it's a massive challenge for the security services dealing with this issue. And of course we have, Europe is not the same. We have such a diverse range of issues, diverse legislation that we need to deal with. In other words, how long do you imprison individuals? What is your ability to use this evidence in a court of law? And of course, we have one of the biggest challenges is that with the existing legislation, many people don't get put away if they're convicted for a very, very long time, which means that what happens in terms of disengagement, de-radicalization in prison is absolutely essential. So you have a lot of different scales of the different problems, but I would say that associated with the foreign fighter issue is also those that tried to leave but didn't succeed, and they have proven to be a huge threat in terms of individuals. And we should not be blindsided by just looking at individual cases. We have to understand that this is also an ecosystem. There are pipelines going down. It extends from preachers, Salafi, jihadi-orientated preachers, who have a whole ecosystem underneath them, and there we need to target through intelligence and law enforcement more effectively, both making it more difficult for funding. I can say in my own country, in Sweden, we had quite difficulty in using legislation and getting people convicted. But that did not prevent the tax authority and others to do Al Capone and focusing in on individuals to see what illegal activity that they had been up to. We have huge amount of children down in the conflict zone. We heard a few days ago 1,400 children, I think Gilles de Kakov mentioned. That is an issue. And we also have, and I think this is the big issue, big danger, is that, who are these? Well, first of all, we have a gender dimension. We have a gender dimension in terms of women, and lots of women have gone down there. They have also have children who have been born down in the caliphate. It's a blessing and a curse in some sense, because it prevents them from coming back because there is no documentation. But it is, of course, also a curse because access to trauma specialists, if they come back, access to psychiatry is hugely underdimensioned. And I can tell you from European perspective, the ones who know anything about ISIS, or the things that you really need to know from a sort of cultural sense of what they have been doing down there, we don't have that reservoir or perhaps understanding, expertise, can make a connection to individuals. I have witnessed that myself after having met people who've come back who are quite young, who do not, when they meet the system, it really sort of doesn't work. I want to say a really important thing, and that is that many of the ones who left from Europe come from segregated suburbs. And maybe one of the reasons they wanted to leave was that they weren't very good criminals, or they wanted to have a new chapter in their life. This gave them a new identity and status. But many of the FTFs also suffer from asocial psychological disorders, which really manifests itself with, and this was even before they left, low impulse control, anger management issue, aggression, how you solve conflicts. So you can imagine then what happens when they've been down in the conflict zone. Their threshold for killing, their international repertoire contacts is so much wider. But understanding these mental health issues is important in the sort of broader, and this involves trauma and psychiatry especially. I also want to mention something really interesting and really important, and I know there may be some people here who have intelligence and security services backgrounds. When you look at what is the available evidence base, or what we know, what we're going to deal with, we don't have a lot to work with, at least not in the open. I know that there is much more in the closed. But I just want to point to one thing that was, I think, accidentally revealed by the German authorities, who did a really interesting study of 784 out of the now almost 1,000. And they had some conclusions that were quite relevant and important. Only 10% of those who returned, about 300-400, were returned because they were disillusioned. That will also vary in terms of your commitment. How can you work with people? But here it comes the bad news for us. Of those that returned, about 300 at the time they did the study, only 25% wanted to cooperate with authorities. And more importantly, 48% returned to radical milieus, which means that we need to focus in on how they impact the existing ecosystem that I already mentioned. The second point I want to make is feeder groups into radicalization. This is part of the ecosystem, but feeder groups are important. Sharia for Belgium, for example, was a very important feeder group. Others have been prosecuted and put into jail. They are now coming out. And many, as the UK have experienced, there are hundreds of individuals who have come out who haven't been down there, but is affecting the radical milieu, the radical environment. Geographical hotspots is something that both on the PV level, the UNDP had recently a very good report on PVE, but geographical hotspots is important. In other words, the problem of returning foreign fighters is not evenly distributed across different cities. So we have to focus in on key cities. Key cities, I think in Belgium it's 3 cities, or a triangle between 3 cities. In my home country, it's 4 cities. 80% who went down from 4 cities. It doesn't mean you should ignore the rest, but you should focus in on getting the local activity right there. Lastly, I just want to say another thing, and that is there are differences in attachment to society at large. We often talk about second, third generation, and they're still important. They're still going to, the returning foreign fighters are going to affect, or they're going to leave. If you speak to anyone from France, well, most of the 2,100 have been or second or third generation. In the German case of the 784, there were 61% born in Germany. And in Sweden, I said this yesterday in a panel, 34% were born in Sweden, even though 75% had citizenship. And 25% of the 125 in Norway were actually born in Norway. So it's not just second and third generation. You also have had some individuals who have come, stayed for a while in the country, and then decided to leave. So we're facing quite a sort of large challenge with this respect. A couple of issues. Can I be telegraphic? Yeah, just very quickly. Very quickly. I think the issue of children should be high on the agenda. It is high on the agenda. One of the challenges, should returnee children be allowed to stay with their families? In France, they are not. They prosecute everyone, and the children are put into social care. Do we have a good handle on ISIS operatives dispersed for long-term attack planning? And many countries want FTFs prosecuted in theater and not returning as a security threat. So I think perhaps the most or the largest challenge we're facing is, and it was mentioned at the conference, how do we use battlefield evidence or digital evidence in the prosecution of them, and what kind of long-term justice will we put in place, whether it's an international type of criminal tribunal to get justice for the victims, etc. This is going to play out for many, many years. Sorry about being lengthy.
Thank you, everyone. Again, my name is Lydia Khalil. I'm with the Lowy Institute. And I think I'll start by addressing the question by maybe pointing to a research paper that we did at Lowy about 1.5 years ago, where we just tried to anticipate this issue of foreign fighter returnees. And we had broadly done the categories according to 4 categories. One would be the stay-behinds, the foreign fighters who decide to fight and take the last stand, or either go to ground in Syria and Iraq at the time. The others would be going to other theaters. So for example, going into Libya or the Sinai or wherever other theater, actually active global jihadist theater that they would be. The third category would be those who would go to third countries. So not active jihadist zones, but for example, other countries where that are not Iraq and Syria or the so-called caliphate at the time, and not their home country, but for example, going to a third country to try to establish either a presence there or go to ground or otherwise hold up until the situation becomes clear. And lastly, the other category would be those going home. Now, I think one of the things, David, you asked what are the key challenges. One of the categories that we didn't anticipate in that paper, and one that is proving to be a key challenge, is those foreign fighters and the families of foreign fighters, women and children in particular, who are in custody outside of formal countries. So for example, there's a huge number of either foreign fighters, particularly women and children as well, who are in SDF and Kurdish custody. Many of the foreign fighters are being prosecuted in Iraq, that these very quick and dirty trials that understandably, they just don't have the infrastructure to deal with the scope of the problem. And these individuals, particularly the ones in Kurdish SDF custody, are in this limbo state. Their home countries don't want to bring them in, especially the Western European countries, and the Kurdish authorities don't have any proper legally recognized mechanism to do with them. So there's a whole category, this 5th category, that we did not anticipate at all when we were first looking at this issue, that I think is one of the key challenges. Maybe the other thing that I can offer too is from the Australian perspective, where where I'm housed and do the research. Unlike Europe and unlike the Middle East, which is dealing with the brunt of the foreign fighter problem, it is quite limited numbers. Again, the precise math of the foreign fighters is very difficult to anticipate, but I've heard numbers anywhere between 100 to 400. So Australian intelligence heads have said publicly it's about 100 or 150 foreign fighters from Australia that have gone. Numbers coming out of Turkey saying that they have 400 people in custody. That probably includes women and children in there. So it's a quite limited number in scope. And so that's been a positive for the Australian perspective in the United States. We are dealing with very, very limited numbers. It's a positive in one sense because we can treat these cases as case-by-case basis. If you're dealing in tens and 100, you can have the luxury of dealing with each individual and returnee family on a case-by-case basis. However, if you're dealing with this scope, as Magnus referenced, in Europe, or even broader, which I'm sure Aaron will talk about within the Middle East, we don't have the luxury of doing that. And the question and the key challenge then becomes, we don't have, or we do not know yet, of very effective reintegration, de-radicalization programs for foreign fighters coming in. And that's particularly important because this particular cohort of foreign fighters, because of the length and the intensity and the brutality of the conflict in Iraq and Syria, are the most highly skilled and highly networked and lethal cadre of fighters. And that is a very significant problem, even more so than the cohort coming out of Afghanistan and in Bosnia generations prior. The other challenge that I would mention, and then leave it at that, is also echo what Magnus said, is about women and children. The children in particular are truly a significant challenge and a tragedy because they are doubly victimized. They didn't have any agency in terms of going to these going to Syria and Iraq. They were brought there by their foreign parents. They certainly weren't asked to be born in a conflict zone in Iraq and Syria. They were victimized by the trauma that they no doubt experienced and the level of violence that they internalized there. And then they're being doubly victimized because upon their potential return or in their custody at the moment, they're being looked at as threats. So children as young as 6, 8, 10, 11 are being taken a look at and spoken about solely as a security threat when they actually are victims. And in fact, the tragedy is that they are both. They are both a security threat and they are victims. They're a security threat, particularly in this iteration of global jihad, because the Islamic State has done what no other organization has done prior, which is the systematic use of children and the indoctrination and the training of children within the global jihad. Now, children have been involved in conflict and conflict zones outside the jihadist theater and within it, and they've been involved and there have been child soldiers, but the mechanisms that the Islamic State used in terms of setting up schools, using them for propaganda, having them commit executions and beheadings, the whole apparatus around how the Islamic State treated children is really extremely worrying when you take a look at, and extremely extraordinary when you take a look at exactly what they have done. So, and they had special schools and training for foreign fighter children. They separated them out from the rest of the Middle Eastern children and the Iraqi and Syrian children as well. So they had a very special focus on them. And in fact, some of their communications has said that these are a better generation than we ever could be of jihadist fighters, and they are saving these foreign fighter children, or children of foreign fighters, for special plans, special operations. Now, make what you will in terms of assessing that threat, but that's certainly extremely concerning. With women as well, many women will say that we went there with our husbands. Some, of course, went there on their own and through their own agency. But when they try to come back or in custody in order to make cases for themselves, they say, well, it wasn't like I thought, I wasn't involved, I was at home, all of these things. But again, the Islamic State has seriously transformed the role of women in jihad. It used to be that it was prohibited for women, officially, ideologically prohibited for women to be involved in jihadist combat. The Islamic State has completely changed that and has, in fact, come out with ideological arguments for why women must become a part, not just of the broader jihad, which they always have been, in terms of indoctrination and education, but in actual combat operations. So it's very difficult, given those two things, this category that we have of women and children, which have been a bit separate from the men. We no longer have that luxury of treating them differently than the male fighters because of what we've been seeing with this conflict. I guess I'll try to end positively, which is saying that we had this worry of this rush of outflow of foreign fighters. That largely hasn't happened, again, because of the policy that Eli had referenced of kill as many foreign fighters at the time. But those are the challenges that I see with women and children, and this challenge of global intelligence sharing when it comes to dealing with this problem of foreign fighters, because it is not strictly a national problem, even though countries are dealing with it through their own national policies. This category, particularly of going to third countries, is especially problematic. For example, Australia has very good relations with Turkish intelligence, so if a foreign fighter tries to outflow through Turkey, we can usually know and understand that in that sense. But if the foreign fighter manages to kind of sneak out through and say go to a country where we do not have as good intelligence sharing of, and it is an Australian national or a foreign fighter who has plans to target Australia or whatever country they come from, then that becomes much more difficult. So this intelligence sharing flow between countries that do not normally have good intelligence relationships or mechanisms, I think is a key aspect to taking a look at this threat going forward.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much, Dave and CTED, for the invitation to be here. I'd love to talk to you a little bit, because people seem to get a lot out of our most recent report on foreign fighters called Beyond the Caliphate. We will be publishing an update to that report this fall. In addition, I'm going to honor the wishes of Richard Barrett, the author of this report, by saying that the numbers are in some cases the least important, or overall the least important thing. The numbers are going to change. What matters is the analysis. I think we have a bit, Dave, you said to stay to 5 minutes, so I will. But we have also categories of returnees that have been identified slightly different than what Lydia just proposed. So the way we think about returnees and foreign fighter, foreign fighter experience is that most returnees will be unlikely to experience anything in their lives at home that matches the intensity of their experience as a member of the Islamic State, whether or not they were fighting on the front. And so if on return they begin again to feel as rootless and lacking in purpose as they did before they left, which is the case for many of them why they went in the first place, they're unlikely to settle back easily into a, quote, normal life. And as IS increases its external campaign, as we're all seeing them do, a campaign of ideology, both through action and propaganda, returnees may be particularly vulnerable to contact from people who are part of the network that recruited them, or appeals from ex-comrades in arms. So our report identifies 5 types of returnees. The first is what we consider to be the early returnees that left the caliphate before its decline, often only after a short stay, and tend to have less sympathy for the Islamic State ideology, so are the least threat once they're home. The second is disillusioned returnees that had doubts about Islamic State tactics and leadership specifically, but not necessarily doubts about its objectives or belief in the caliphate, which means that they would be susceptible to joining another group. The third are thrill-seeker returnees who have had their fill of adventure and heroics under the Islamic State and are likely to seek new theaters of jihad. The fourth are forced and or captured returnees that are likely to remain committed to Islamic State ideology. They are much more likely to recruit, form cells, and mount future attacks. And the last, as has been referenced already, operational returnees who have been actually sent back by the Islamic State to plan and carry out attacks abroad. Technically not returnees, but we sort of treat them in the same way. I won't talk about women and children because Lydia already has, but we do know that the caliphate considered anyone over 15 an adult, but children as young as 9 or perhaps younger have been trained to use weapons and taught to kill. Given the numbers involved, and so the numbers are shifting a little bit, but we quoted in our report over 40,000 people from over 110 countries went to join the Islamic State. The problem for authorities is, of course, prioritizing targets and in establishing what sort of approach to take. We know that allocating more resources to security is important, but not always the answer. We have to reduce the threat, and I'm sure we'll get into that in the Q&A, Dave. But if we don't have the threat at a manageable level, we'll never be able to surveil all the people that a state wants to surveil. It is literally impossible. Well, there may be some states who can manage that, I'm not sure, but for example, in my home country of the United States. And in any case, that policy may be more likely to increase terrorism than to reduce it. So the options, of course, as we all know, are incarceration with all of the risks that incarceration comes with, radicalization in prison, the expense of incarceration. And the second approach described as rehabilitation and reintegration. Although it's important to note that most people we refer to as returnees were not integrated in the first place. So to call it reintegration is a bit of a misnomer. And the problem with those programs are they're very hard to design and run. The majority of the efforts have stuttered or come to a halt. And they can be extremely resource intensive and very hard to sell to a constituency, not just in an election year, but all the time. People will often say, why are terrorists treated better than other criminals? Why are they given these programs? Excuse me. So we advocate for, and I'll end with this, Dave, we advocate for a whole of society response to this problem. Multi-stakeholder engagement is key, and that means 6 main categories we see of actors in this struggle. The first is government, which includes, of course, law enforcement, but education, public health officials as well, policymakers, and especially, we believe, increasingly mayors or people at the city level who understand what their local problem is and can deal with it better. The second is the nonprofit sector. That includes not just the practitioners, but also the funders and philanthropists. There are billions of dollars every year that get spent on efforts around security, whether that's countering violent extremism efforts, SSR, rule of law, good governance, anti-corruption. All of this can be done better and in a more directed way, in a more unified way. Religious leaders, in order to increase cultural awareness and bridge building, I don't need to sell anybody in this audience on how important that is. The private sector. One of the cases we make is that conflict is bad for business. It's good for some businesses, but overall it's bad for business, unless you're an arms dealer or defense contractor. Companies are not only of the communities in which they operate, but also the communities that they sell to. So there's a huge stake in this for corporations to have the world be a more peaceful place. The research and academics, of course, and the bi and multilateral institutions. So, for example, on 2396 specifically, at one particular off-the-record conversation I was privy to with a prime minister from a European country and a number of ambassadors from the UN, the conversation around the table was, how do we all have a consistent approach to implementing 2396? Magnus is talking about how difficult it is just among the Nordic countries and Europe in general that have a union. What about for the rest of us who are operating independently? It's a huge global challenge to work together. But I think that I'll leave it there, Dave, and we can talk about more after.
Thanks for having me on this panel. I think a lot of people know about the foreign fighter flows to Syria and Iraq at this point, but one of the lesser focused on, but just as relevant foreign fighter challenges, I think, is in relation to the large amount of foreign fighters that went to Libya. About 41 nations are represented of individuals who have gone to Libya since 2011. And based off of data I've collected from primary sources from jihadi groups, information I've gotten access to from the Libyan Attorney General, as well as local media reporting, suggests that between 2,600 to 3,500 individuals from foreign nations went to Libya to join jihadi groups for the most part since 2011. Of course, it's not as unprecedented as the case of Syria, but if you look at the broader history of foreign fighting within the global jihadi movement, it's still the 4th largest mobilization now. Of course, a lot of them are from Tunisia, about 1,500. But what's interesting about the case of Libya, especially after IS built a presence there in 2014, is that for the first time you really saw people from East and West Africa becoming foreign fighters. Historically, most individuals would remain in or get involved in insurgencies locally or in their neighboring country, whether in Nigeria, Mali, or Somalia. But you saw a number of people from a lot of these nations that actually went all the way up to Libya, and this has had consequences now, which I'll get to in a second. So countries such as Sudan and Senegal, Eritrea, Ghana, Gambia, even places as random as Rwanda, which is a majority Christian country. So it's definitely something that most people aren't thinking about. And of course, IS doesn't control territory in Libya anymore. They haven't since December 2016. So it's not necessarily a destination zone now in terms of people going to Libya specifically, unless you're some of the most hardcore individuals. But what's relevant is the building up of these logistics and facilitation networks to get to Libya in the first place. So if you go online to the report I wrote called The Others, Foreign Fighters in Libya, I have a bunch of maps in the report looking at sort of how people got from their particular country to get into Libya. And it illustrates that there's this strong logistical network, not only outside of Libya to get in, but within Libya, there were a number of key nodes in villages and cities that people were going through to get to the hot spots of places like Sirte, Benghazi, and Derna. This is important, though, for a number of reasons. One is that they can use these same networks for the outflow of people going back to their home countries to start up homegrown movements, for people to go on to other conflict zones and invigorate those even more, or use them for dual purpose issues like getting involved possibly in smuggling and trafficking, whether humans or other types of products, I guess you can say, for a lack of a better term. In addition to that, what I think the biggest thing for me, especially in countries that really don't have a history of jihadi involvement or activism historically, such as maybe like a Senegal or a Ghana, is that these countries haven't really thought through these issues or necessarily have laws on the books in relation to terrorism. And if they are, they might not be as robust necessarily as other countries that have been dealing with it for so many years or decades at this point. So for me, this movement of individuals that are first getting involved in this and really creating the seeds of the potential for broader homegrown movements in the future reminds me in some ways of when Europeans went to Bosnia in the early to mid 1990s, where at the time it didn't seem like that big of a deal, and there's a handful of individuals here or there from different European nations. But of course, as we know, that grew into what became the al-Muhajiruns of the world, the Sharia 4 groups, and so on and so forth. Obviously, the context is different. In Western Europe, these individuals are minorities, where in some of these other countries I mentioned, they're part of the broader majority population, but it is something to think about since there is such a history of this. I think, sometimes we get so stuck in the now, but there's a lot of information that happened in the 80s and 90s that are still just as relevant, that could be used to learn going forward, even if most people don't pay attention to it as much. In terms of sort of issues going forward, one of the things that's interesting is that some of these networks have now been repurposed to send people up into the Sinai with Wilayat Sinai. Of course, the number of foreign fighters in Sinai is nowhere near Libya. It's nowhere near Syria. It's, in the dozens, maybe low hundreds at most. But you do see people from places in Africa, East Africa in particular, using some of these facilitation logistics networks to get into the Sinai, as well as even people from Central Asia that were coming from Syria to then go up into the Sinai through Turkey to Sudan, and then through there being smuggled. There is the issue of people going to third countries from Libya as well. And then in terms of Tunisia, since I mentioned that it probably had almost or more than half of the amount of people that actually went to Libya, which is not surprising since the countries are next to each other. And since 2011, prior to IS, the two main groups in the country, Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia and Ansar al-Sharia in Libya, were sister organizations that work together. But for me, although you still see low-scale attacks here and there every once in a while in Tunisia, mainly against security forces, both from AQIM's front group, Katibat Uqba bin Nafi, as well as small IS cells. The future of the movement in many ways is in the prison system. The Tunisian government has arrested thousands of jihadis or jihadi-related individuals over the last couple of years. I was in Tunisia just a couple of months ago, and I was talking to people in the security and military, and they're talking about how in the prison system, there's a lot of cells built up within there. Clearly, they're planning for whenever they get out of prison, and therefore, I think it's important to get involved in rehabilitation and reintegration. It's obviously not as sexy as, you know, kinetic operations, but the reality is if you've seen the history of jihadism, prison has been an incubator, whether for creating plans for the future or getting new people involved that were just in for petty criminal activities. It also could be problematic if there are prison breaks, though I'm less concerned about that necessarily in Tunisia since it's not a war zone, but maybe more of a situation akin to France, where you've seen within the French prison system, there's been planning and recruitment, and then, you know, we saw people joining up for fighting or later involved in terrorist attacks and plots within France. So yeah, I definitely think it's important, while it's not as focused on, and it doesn't have as much of maybe a Western angle to it, beyond maybe if there was obviously the Berlin attack and the Manchester bombing that are connected to IS in Libya, but beyond that, you didn't see too many Westerners going to Libya. But it is still very relevant, especially in the Arab world and in different parts of the African continent. So I think it's important to discuss that as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. And thanks, everyone. I feel like we've covered a huge amount of ground in quite a short space of time. And apart from Ellie at the start, there's not been a huge amount of optimism. But I think some of the key issues you've all touched upon are incredibly relevant. I think the role of prison that Aaron sort of finished with there, but also the role of prison that Magnus talked about in Europe, sort of shows both sides of that issue, that in Europe we have seen quite short sentences, and that raises the question of, is there enough time for rehabilitation and reintegration programs to have any effect? But then perhaps in other circumstances we see longer prison sentences, which really can lead to that incubation and long-term impact. I'm also really glad that Aaron touched on the history element, because I think there is a lot we can learn from previous foreign fighter flows, even though this one has been significantly larger, more diverse, and more complex. So I think I might start firstly with you, Ellie. You did start with some positive news, which I think was great. You touched on a number of different potential destinations for FTFs who are relocating, but apart from perhaps Afghanistan, which you touched on, none of them, and Libya, but none of them seem to have really attracted the numbers that perhaps we might be expecting. So could I just ask whether you think there is a sort of one destination that we should be looking at, or whether this is, you know, as part of the discussions we've had throughout the week, this is this fragmentation and diffusion, and it's unrealistic to see one sort of destination in the same way we saw with Iraq and Syria?
Yes, I was optimistic, as I said, because on the short time, at least, there are problems and there are challenges. But I didn't discuss what happens in Europe generally, because not only the returnees are a problem, what is existing already, including those which did not receive asylum seekers and so on. I referred only to the returnees and many European ones. And numbers matter, Meredith. If we had 5,000 leaving Europe and only 2,500 a physical return, it's a change, a difference, because we know what are the possibilities of the law enforcement and the security forces to monitor these numbers. We know that in France today they speak about 40,000 people which could be potential terrorists, okay? So clearly the fact that many were killed, some are in Iraqi prisons, and some have relocated, as I said, to Libya or to especially Afghanistan. It's important at this stage at least. And I didn't speak indeed about the others, and I want to refer to two main groups. The North Africans, those which speak, and we know that were 6,000 Tunisians, 2,500 Moroccans at least, and also Libyans, those who speak French, and who do not, for instance, want to return to Morocco and to Tunisia because they understand what will happen to them there. Many of them perhaps will go to France or Belgium or Luxembourg even, because it's easier to arrive to a country where they speak French. The issue of women and children is very important. I won't enter here in a discussion about the children because it's a very difficult problem on the psychological, social, and if you want, even a neurological level. But the issue of women, it is clear a big problem. We know, as I said, that in Mosul there were 32 women which were suicide bombers, which is a change in the strategy, which means that this is a pool of people who can become terrorists. By the way, this happened in the Hamas and even with Fatah during the Second Intifada. The moment operationally they could use young people between 18 and 30 because they couldn't pass the border, they sent the women. So this is a very important problem. There are some 500, perhaps even 1,000 women in prison in Iraq. And there is now a negotiation, by the way, between the Iraqi authorities and the European authorities. What to do with these women, okay? Do you permit them to return? And how much they were involved, not as a spouse for somebody, but involved in the organization, in the administration, the level, various levels of the organization. So North Africans, I think, Aaron rightly said, not only to Libya, but also to the Sahel and southern of the Sahel, which are very uncontrollable and unstable regions. This is a problem. And there is an issue of Central Asians. In Stockholm, April 2015, or 17, there was an attack by Uzbek. And then in St. Petersburg, and in Germany, Chechens. Just last week, Chechen knifed people in Paris. There were at least 4,700 Caucasians and Central Asians in Syria and Iraq. By the way, at very high levels, some of them were governors and very important military leaders. Some of them came from Europe. From Europe, we gave them political asylum because they were oppressed in Russia or in Central Asia. Now, these people can return because they have an official status of asylum seekers or asylum receiving, and also I see Uyghurs. Today there are, some say 3,000, I don't believe, but several hundred Uyghurs in Idlib, in region Idlib, some in Turkey, and the Chinese are asking to participate in the fight for Idlib because they want to kill them. These people can go to Europe, okay, and say, you know what happens with our brothers in Xinjiang, which are oppressed, indeed oppressed, and under huge control. So give us political asylum. And what will happen? I think there is a good reason to, they will be accepted. Now, I think in this issue of the returnees, there is an issue of criminalization. You said, Magnus, that 25% don't want to cooperate. Clearly, many of them are assassins, okay? They killed hundreds of people, if not thousands of people. So I think it's very important in what happens not only to criminalize them because they were present or they infringed the law living for Syria, but to see, among the immigrants also there's a problem. Who were the criminals, the war criminals, that came from Syria and Iraq? And what to do? They cannot be tried for 2 years, 3 years. If they killed 5 or 10 or 15 people, like the Nemush, which was responsible for the first attack in Brussels Museum, the Jewish Brussels Museums. He was responsible for torturing European journalists. And he is on trial, I don't know how much he will receive. He even asked to be tried in Belgium and not in France. Why? So on the issue of legislature, on the law level and juridical system, something has to be changed. And I think it's also politically and psychologically, criminalization of these people will show to other people, these were not freedom fighters. These were assassins. They decapitated their own people or Syrian soldiers or Syrian civilians, okay?
So if I could just jump in on that point, because I think it's a really important one and something that Magnus touched on as well.
Yeah.
And I think
and one more thing, nobody speaks about the Shia foreign fighters. Nobody. I think on one of the panels, there are at least 40,000 Afghani, Pakistani, Iraqi, Lebanese, Yemenis. Now they are a pool for going after this kind of conflict will be somehow stabilized. Okay, we know that the Hezbollah Hezbollah infrastructure in West Africa and Latin America was based or is based on many fighters of Hezbollah, which in the 80s were fighting in Lebanon, either against the Christians, either against even the Amal, sometimes against the Syrian, by the way, and they then went to Latin America because their families or their community was there. And they became the infrastructure of Hezbollah for Iran. What will happen not with 40,000, but 2,000 of these fighters if they go to other regions?
I feel like you might have switched from optimism to pessimism with your second answer. And this is maybe just a quick question both for Magnus and for Lydia. You both rightly raised the issue of children, and I think the broad range of issues around them being treated as a threat, while for all intents and purposes are victims. I think Magnus was also fairly pessimistic first time around, so I just wondered, both from your respective experiences in Europe and to some extent Australia as well, whether you had any positive stories around processes that were working in that space.
I should have said also that my other daytime job or nighttime job is I work as the quality manager of the EU Radicalization Awareness Network Center of Excellence, and we are a practitioner-led network. 3,000 practitioners all across the EU working on all sorts of extremism, the frontline workers. And we've centralized some of that expertise. We have a manual on returnees. I should have said that before. We have a manual where we were instructed by the Commission to do a practical manual. If you search on my last name, Ranstorp and returnee, you will find it, or EU RAN. And it's from out there, coming back, case management, police, risk assessment, and one of the issues is conducting risk assessment is absolutely key. If I were going to put all my money into anything, it would be prison and probation, risk management. We looked at all the risk management models, they're good. We looked at Vera 2 is coming out, and so on. We did a risk investigative tool, which hasn't been tested, which should be tested, in terms of returning foreign fighters. So you will find a lot of stuff in that manual. In terms of the children, the good news is the ones who are much better educated on this issue, I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, but the ones I speak to within the EU say that, look, you do not do de-radicalization of young people. You just have to replace them from that environment, providing lots of stability, support, warmth. But it raises, of course, the question, should they be removed? And of course, that the jury's out whether you should do that. In France, you do that. Most of them are prosecuted. Most of them are put into social care. I think it's an issue that will be very difficult for the EU. In our countries, very little is being done in relation to the children, and particularly access to trauma and trauma expertise. So it's some positive news and also some negative.
Well, on the Australian context, it's a very difficult question to answer because there's been this veil of secrecy around, number one, who is returning and how they're returning. So, for example, the Australian authorities don't publicly release any of their reintegration programs at all, whether it's for returning foreign fighters or individuals who they've deemed to be radicalized at home, either within or without the prison system. So that's been a difficult thing for researchers to kind of get access to and assess because they're very, very tight-lipped about it. There was one case of a woman and child, I believe, where she negotiated her return back into Australia that was publicly acknowledged. I think there have been one or two other cases. I do understand from off-the-record conversations that there has been, a surveillance and social service network around that. But again, these are like ones and twos, so very, very limited information, very limited case studies, and very difficult to assess that. In terms of the other numbers, for example, the large number of women and children who are in Iraqi custody and SDF custody that I referenced to earlier, I think that is much more problematic. So you hear news reports of them getting life sentences after summary trials, but those life sentences are maximum 20 years. So, you know, that's on one hand not very long if they are involved, you know, in operations and atrocities. On the other hand, they're extremely long if they are victims in there. There's no programs within the Iraqi or the SDF system to deal with any reintegration or rehabilitation at all. And the children are just there with their mothers receiving no education, no services. So it's quite a dire situation in that context. But from the Australian context, it's very difficult to establish any kind of efficacy because of the limited cases and information.
Thanks. I think probably this last joint question for Aaron and Meredith, and we might throw it out to some Q&A. So I think you both talk quite a lot about prisons, and I think that the massive question of rehabilitation and reintegration. So possibly a similar question for both of you about whether there's anything you've seen in your research and your travels where you think this looks like this specific country or particular programs have got the right approach.
I think Aaron might speak to some more particular countries. We get asked this a lot. What are the success stories from everywhere, from the Counter-Terrorism Bureau at the State Department to the Counter-ISIL Coalition? Everybody wants to know. And I sort of feel like if you guys don't know, I don't know why you think we know. But what I said most recently to the Counter-ISIL Coalition was we have mountains of evidence about what happens in prison. We don't have mountains of evidence of what happens after the collapse of the largest, foreign terrorist fighter movement in known history. It's too soon. We simply don't know. We can make some estimations based on the Soviet jihad and the Balkans, and I think there's probably a wealth of information there we can learn from. I think that we also know certain other common sense things. You both talked about children, and just to put a different point on the same issue, we have thousands of stateless children who can't get vaccines, who can't get an education. They are even if they're not, in prisons, they don't have any services. They're growing up stateless because it's a patrilineal society in Syria, and they can't prove who their fathers are. So it's a huge crisis. I mean, we want to think about what radicalization looks like. I mean, what's that generation of children going to become? So sometimes it's looking at what we know we don't know that's more important. And in terms of who's doing what, I mean, the Russians, I mean, there have been a number of articles about this, are sending children back to their grandparents in Chechnya, for example. I know everybody pulls out the same example, but it's because it's one of the few examples people point to as almost best practice right now. There's Sabun in Pakistan, which people point to. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, but that's another success story. People talk about the model in Saudi Arabia around rehabilitation. I think we don't know. Yeah, we know what they report about it, and I think everybody's looking for the silver bullet. The reason that and I would say, Ellie, I don't want to misquote Richard. It's not that the numbers aren't important. We have a chapter devoted entirely to the numbers, but the analysis is equally important, and there's finite resources, and so it's a question of what to do with the resources that you have, and you simply cannot incarcerate every returnee. It's not going to happen. So, and then there's the whole extended network. So we've got to think more critically about what we can do.
I'll talk about Tunisia because I know that probably the best, since I have a forthcoming book about the history of Tunisian jihadism. I think Tunisia is an interesting context when you look at it in comparison with other countries. In other countries, you see like maybe 2, 3, 4 hotspots in like certain neighborhoods or cities in the whole country. You can kind of look at there. In Tunisia, it's a national issue. There are people from every single area of the country that have gotten involved, whether from 2011 to 13 with Ansar al-Sharia locally, whether on in Syria and Iraq or Libya. So I think a lot of it has to be at a communal level. And one of the interesting pieces of research that's come out recently by Julie Chernoff-Huang, who recently came out with a book about the disengagement of Indonesian jihadists, is that you essentially have to replace the social network and movement that they were involved with jihadis with a new social movement, essentially within the mainstream context of society. So I think at least in the Tunisian case, that makes a lot of sense too, since there's so many people that have been involved. And, you know, if you talk to any Tunisian or most Tunisians, they'll say they know somebody that went abroad, whether a friend from high school or who they grew up with, a family member, distant relative, so on and so forth. So I think that that's part of it. In some ways, it's kind of similar, I guess, to what the Saudis have done, though without the money and the apartments and cars and wives, since, you know, Tunisia doesn't have that kind of money.
Don't forget the art therapy.
Yeah, the art therapy. But I do think it is an approach that I think would work in the Tunisian context. Like, the question is if the government would actually do this, since I know that the EU has tried to work with the Tunisians about some of these issues, but I don't know how much implementation there has actually been. There's been mostly just a pure security approach. So, I mean, you know, the old saying goes, you can bring the camel to the water, but if it doesn't drink the water, it doesn't really matter. So even if people want to provide the best practices and things like that to a country like Tunisia, and the government's not interested in doing it, it doesn't matter. Though I think it's important to note that not every single person that has returned from Syria, Iraq, and Libya has gone to prison. And because there haven't been that many attacks, that means not all these people have, you know, returned back to what they had before. So it's possible, just based off of people wanting to get back to their own life also, that they've been reintegrated into their community and family, and therefore that provided a stable atmosphere for them to, you know, go on in the future without any intervention of the state. Of course, that's a completely natural thing, and you can't just say, let's see if this works or not, since it's completely random. But it does show that not everyone necessarily needs to even be in some type of program in the first place if they're fully just want to move on and realize that it was a bad decision or they made a mistake or so on and so forth.
Great, thanks. Perhaps we'll take 2 or 3 questions in one go, and if you could let me know if it's directed at a specific panel member, that would be great. So we've got one over there.
David, and thank you to the panel. I've been to Soufan, and I know Fareeha Paracha, who should be part of this discussion, the leading neuropsychologist that led the de-radicalization program and reintegration program, which does have success in the Northwest Frontier Province. It involves not just re-educating the child in basic literacy, in Islam, re-educating the community and creating jobs in the community that the community will tolerate, that a former child suicide operative, potential suicide operative, is safe. And that's been in place. I saw it in about 2008 or so at that year. I just came back from Kurdistan, and in fact, Stevie and I were trying to see if we could get Professor Jan Kizilhan, who is building the psychologists that are rehabilitating children that have returned from ISIS soldiering. I interviewed both a child Taliban soldier and a child ISIS soldier. So with the child ISIS soldier, what was different is while he had come back after 3 years in captivity, abducted by ISIS, collected all the children in a cinema in Mosul, and then sent off to Syria. They dehumanized them initially with video content. They use drugs, and then they get them to act out amputations on dolls, then human beings. They reward them planting landmines with falafel sandwiches and $15. This goes on for 3 years. They psychologically rehabilitate them. His sister and his mother are in captivity with ISIS because he was a Yazidi child. So that's the complexity. A child can be a child operative and of course evicted while the family is still incarcerated. However, Professor Kizilhan has shown the data that integrating the child with original family units, so I saw this child with the father, with the sibling, living with the grandmother, is one of the best ways. And this child was 14 when I interviewed him in May. He went into captivity at age 10. Is one of the many children that are showing signs of resilience and recovery. So one recommendation, when we come back on this again, Professor Kizilhan and Dr. Paracha should be here. And what I'm hearing, I'm not educated in your field, is there is little transfer of the expertise in these zones, which is still conflict rich, back to the Western diaspora, which is where my home is. And that we need to help with that.
Thank you. Any other questions?
There
all the
Everything
questions.
is clear.
Covered everything.
Everything.
Covered everything early.
Is the hour.
No, we've still got time. Magnus, yeah, I mean, I'm happy to continue. We've got at least another 5 minutes before I start summing this up. So yeah, I think maybe we'll continue on the problems of European policy.
European policies.
If you want to briefly make some remarks on European policies, we can move from there. Sure.
I think that Europe, almost all the countries were not prepared for the wave of foreign fighters going to fight. In my opinion, some 3-4 years of late to pass the message to the politicians. I mean, from the law enforcement and security service to the politicians. And in France, in Belgium, only after the big attacks, they began to take the measures, first of all, on the juridical level, which is very important. We saw it in Spain, for instance, how important, and even in Britain. And then on the personnel and technologies employed. Because if after Charlie Hebdo they had to recruit 3,000 new law enforcement and security personnel, it takes 3-4 years to prepare them to deal with this issue. So if we are expecting several thousands of returnees, it's clear that you have to invest a lot in personnel, in technology, and not only on the level of law enforcement, but we saw social workers and neurologists and psychiatrists and so on to deal with all this problem, which for the medium and even perhaps longer term will influence our societies.
Thanks, Ellie. Magnus, you
Well, I have to come back on that. I have to defend the security services and the law enforcement. But the politicians probably don't need defending. But I mean, they're doing unprecedented sharing, both bilaterally with Europol. We know who the foreign fighters are, and they're doing all the work. The problem is that they are alone in doing this work. The police and the intelligence services are doing this. They should be, I mean, they are the last defense, but they are the first and only defense. And where we really need to invest is this CVE, on the CVE issues. And if you're going to sort of unpack that, what we really need to do is to be more effective in terms of risk assessment in prison and probation. We need to develop effective interrogation techniques or effective dialogue techniques with individuals who are really hardened. We have some of that. I'm sure they can learn a lot here from this region in Israel in particular. How do you carry out? How do you get into a home to really make that sort of assessment? What is the protective factors of families, or are they part of the problem? How do you get your foot in the door? The real problem in the European level is it's not on the national level, it's on the local level. The extremists live on the local level, and how do you push down the national expertise on the local level in the city level? And you know, we have the formula, we have the template, we know what to do, but the problem is that we have independent municipalities who decide what to do on the prevention space. If you don't have the political support, if you don't have information sharing protocols between different agencies, if you have not thought through mentorship, I mean, I want to give credit to Denmark. Denmark has a template that's evidence-based, that is tried and tested in relation to having mentorship, in having psychological support, in having parent support, and that is not in replacement, sometimes in the public dialogue. It's sort of like, you know, let's not do CV or PV, it's too soft. You know, we all want to lock them up. Well, I want to lock them up too. I think we should be tough, but we should be on act within the rule of law. You know, having prosecution, law enforcement, intelligence efforts does not exclude the fact that we should also simultaneously have national and local action plans and different efforts. And I think, and sometimes, and that's when I come back to my last point, is often looking at sort of, you know, a whole cookie cutter menu, one city that has solved it all. But I would break it down into different components that what we need to use and to tailor-made into particular context. But I would say the strong cities network, creating more sharing between local coordinators in the city level, with the help from the national level, is absolutely the right way to go. How far have we come? Very, infant steps, I'm afraid to say. I do think we need to accelerate, because this is where the problem is going to be, in the prison and probation area, and in thinking through the release of prisoners into society. How can we lock them in, making sure? How can we have sensors that can be early warning systems that they do not tip over into violence?
Thanks, Magnus. I think we've just got a question here in the middle, and then we probably have to wrap it up from there, I'm afraid.
Nobody seems to approach the question of the role of social media, particularly those that radicalized initially, and what is their role or effect in re-radicalizing?
Would anybody like to address that?
With foreign fighters specifically, do you mean? With foreign fighters specifically, do you mean?
Well, and with your particular children.
Well, I mean, I can just say briefly, obviously, social media has played a very large role in terms of both spreading the message ideologically and radicalizing individuals and extorting individuals to go, but it's only one of very many factors. I think that there's a great deal of attention that's being paid toward social media, but for example, I can take a look at some Islamic State propaganda video, and it's not going to make me want to go over there. It didn't, in 2014. So there has to be some other things happening and going on with you in order for you to be receptive of that message. So when we take a look at people who were either enjoined to go to the fight in Syria or Iraq or Libya in the first instance to become foreign fighters, social media is not, it's not what did it. It was not the, it certainly helped to spread the message. It helped to spread the legitimacy. It helped to spread that feeling that they were involved in something important, but it was not necessarily the driving factor. There had to be many other driving factors that are very particular to that individual and particular to the context in which they come from.
Aaron, just quickly.
I think it's also important to contextualize, what was going on then and what's going on now. Social media is a catch-all term, but each platform is different in how it's used and how it can be used. So the primary platform being used in the spreading and recruitment of individuals in 2012 through 15 was primarily Twitter. That's a completely open system. Anybody can see anything, anybody can get exposed to anything, and therefore anybody could potentially get involved. Whereas now it's mostly on Telegram, which is an encrypted application. You have to know where to go. You have to find the people specifically, so it's more of a hybrid or closed system, and therefore it's a lot more difficult for people just randomly to stumble upon it. And we've seen people in ISIS and Al-Qaeda and jihadis in general complain that they don't have this large audience. It's become more of an echo chamber in some ways. So I think the dynamic is different now than it was a few years ago. That's not to say it's not an issue, as Lydia noted, but it's not just this, like fire hose that people are drinking from now in some regards. It's a lot more limited. Obviously, that could change if some other platform comes about that has more of an open system and jihadis are able to exploit it. But right now, it's more akin to how it was prior to Twitter, like the password-protected forums of the mid-2000s and early part of this decade.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm sure we definitely have more questions, but I think Stevie would probably not thank me if we overran. A lot to cover, a lot to summarize. I think I'd just like to make 3 very quick points before we all get across to A206 for the next session. I think the first thing that's been apparent from everyone's contributions today is how much of a long-term problem this is. In some ways, we've had a lot of positives in terms of the risk and the threat that FTFs have posed so far, but I think it's clear from both the age of a lot of the returnees, but the scale that this is not going to be something that goes away anytime soon. The second point I'd like to make, and a connected one, is the question around rehabilitation and reintegration, and the fact that whilst the UN Security Council is clear that prosecution is the first stage to respond to returning FTFs, the rehabilitation and reintegration is the only way that we're going to make this problem manageable long term. And so I think learning from examples of programs that are actually working, have that evidence base, is going to be really crucial moving forward, and it's something that is an international problem. So I think the more sharing we can get around best practices and lessons learned, the better. I think probably the final point, and perhaps because of the scale and because of the long-term nature and because the threat hasn't been quite as big as we might have expected so far, is the real danger of counter-terrorism fatigue, where, you know, there's all sorts of, you only need to read the news for one day to see how much is going on in global affairs right now, and there is a real sense that with counter-terrorism, ISIL defeated in quotation marks in Iraq and Syria, that the will and the political will and the energy and the resources required to really deal with this across this long term might not be there. So I think firstly, caution against that, and secondly, really stress the role of the UN and the role of CTED in terms of facilitating a lot of this work. Most of the issues we've discussed today are going to be a massive priority for CTED over the coming years, and we look forward to working with as many of you as possible to help solve them, or manage them perhaps rather than solve. Thanks so much.